Honourable member for Calgary Centre.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise today because of a question I asked some time ago in the House of Commons that went unanswered in many respects. And we talked about, at that point in time, the inflation and the cost the toll it was taking on Canada's business, both in their ability to borrow and, in fact, the bankruptcies that were happening across Canada, and that's on the rise here as well. Well, I asked that question. It was just before the budget came out on March 28th, and I asked the Prime Minister, I asked the government to ensure there were no new taxes coming forward in the budget to ensure that there was not more burden felt by Canadians and by Canadian businesses in particular to the rising cost of CPI, the cost of living index in Canada. This is something that continues to haunt Canadians, and it has haunted us for more again, as we've seen in the last little while. There was a point here when it looked like the Bank of Canada was actually getting inflation under control. And when I say under control, I mean back down to about the 4% level, about double where it actually needs to be in order for this economy to manage where it is deemed to be stable between 1% and 3%. Usually we say around 2%. And that's not happening anymore. We had to go back in June 7th, and the Bank of Canada came and raised the interest rate, the bank rate again, because of the CPI that was continuing to increase. Well, why did the CPI increase in April, after April? Well, guess what happened after the budget? The government imposed an increase in the carbon tax, a new tax, 30% of which was felt directly by consumers. And the government will tell you that they get all their money back. And yet that's been proven time and time again by objective officers of Parliament that in fact that is an in-out scheme where Canadians are being fooled about how much they're getting back. On top of that, the government's designing a new tax on July 1st that's actually going to double the effect of that, a clean fuels regulation that's actually going to take a total now of 61 cents average per litre in gasoline out of the pockets of Canadians. Now, you can't sit there and impose more taxes, more costs on Canadians without it having an effect on everything they buy. And that in itself creates inflation. These things all flow all the way through the value chain. When you increase the cost of things, you increase inflation. When you increase inflation, you increase the cost of debt, and you devalue the work that people actually do because everything costs more. Therefore, what they used to take home doesn't buy as much, it's not worth as much to them as was what it was before you created the inflation. So we have more inflation. We are on a spiral. This government continues to create more inflation. Think about everything it's doing here. It is over budget on everything it's doing. A $41 billion deficit plan for this year is already out of date. 3 months in to when that budget was planned, we are already well past that. We've got all kinds of industrial commitments that the government never foresaw for some strange reason that they actually have to pay the bill at the end of the day. In addition, interest rates go up, and interest rates are going up again. They don't just go up for Canadians, they go up for the Canadian government. The Canadian government is going to pay more in interest this year because the bank rate just went up, and that causes more interest to be paid by the government, which causes more interest to be paid by Canadians. This is a vicious cycle. The government needs to get over it. Will it please commit to looking at inflation and stop the increase in costs upon Canadians?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Well, I guess there's a number of thoughts that come to mind, Madam Speaker. First and foremost, we can understand and we can appreciate the degree in which inflation is hurting Canadians. And, you know, I guess I would ask the Conservative Party to collectively understand what it is that I just finished saying and support some of the initiatives that the government is doing to be able to assist Canadians, whether it's Canadians through the dental program, the grocery rebate program, Madam Speaker. These are helping Canadians in a very real and tangible way. The member talked about the price on pollution. And even though 338 Conservative candidates made a campaign promise to have a price on pollution. I respect that they did flip-flop on the issue, Madam Speaker, even though they did promise Canadians. And what is misleading is when Conservatives will stand up and try to give the impression that the Parliamentary Budget Officer was wrong when he made the statement saying that 80% of the Canadians would in fact receive more money, real dollars, in terms of money that is put in. That means 80% of the residents of Winnipeg North are going to be receiving more of a rebate, which again helps with the issue of inflation. So there is a consistency problem. The Conservatives talk about inflation rate, and as I said, we are concerned. We're taking actions, even though the Conservatives don't support it. But we also need to recognize that around the world, inflation is hitting. It's something that's not unique to Canada. What's unique to Canada is that Canada's inflation rate is substantially less than the inflation rate of many of the European countries. It has been less than the U.S., England, and Germany, other European countries. Relatively speaking, Canada inflation rate is high. But again, we recognize that the hardship that it costs, and as a result, we put into place a number of budgetary measures in order to support Canadians in a very real and tangible way. Imagine the frustration that we don't hear ideas coming from the Conservative Party, Madam Speaker, outside of the issue of cryptocurrency, which the leader of the Conservative Party, and we're still waiting for the apology. Remember, the leader of the Conservative Party said that, look, you want to fight inflation? Go to cryptocurrency. Those people that would have followed that advice, Madam Speaker, would have lost 60+% of their investment. Other economic recommendations coming from the minister, the leader of the Conservative Party, included things like getting rid of the governor of the Bank of Canada. That is something that is very well respected across not only here in Canada, but other jurisdictions in the world, recognizing the important role that the Bank of Canada plays in our society, a society that is doing exceptionally well, whether it's the deficit, the GDP, or our ability to be able to have better controls on the issue of inflation. How does the Conservative Party respond, in particular the leader of the Conservative Party? Get rid of, fire the governor of the Bank of Canada. How silly of an idea was that one, Madam Speaker? I don't think we need to take advice coming from the Conservative Party because they've clearly demonstrated that they don't understand it.
The honourable for Calgary Centre.
Madam Speaker, thank you. I know it's late, and I know my colleague across the way probably didn't even listen to what I had to say, but the answer was obviously disconnected from any question I actually had. We talked about inflation. I didn't talk about much else that he referred to in there. Nevertheless, I will go on for this minute here about inflation and what his government is causing. He did say one thing that I want to address here. He did say, well, the more things go up, the more Canadians get harmed by the inflation this government has caused, the more they'll give them more checks, find ways to kind of put a little bit of money back in their pockets, much like with the carbon tax they talk about. We take a bunch of money out of your pocket, but don't worry, we'll give you a check for a little bit back, and you'll be happy with it, and we'll pretend and we'll give a bunch of misinformation in the House of Commons that 80% of you are better off. Well, I think that a lot of people have disputed that rather substantially. In any event, continuing to abet inflation is not the way to address inflation. Would you please commit to doing something to actually address inflation that he is causing?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Well, Madam Speaker, with respect to the member's initial comments, he should read the speech that he gave in his 4 minutes, and you'll find that I addressed it directly, with the one exception, and that was when I talked about conservative ideas related to dealing with the issue of inflation, and all I was doing is regurgitating ideas that were generated from the leader of the Conservative Party, and I suspect that likely makes him a little bit nervous, as I'm sure it makes a lot lot of Canadians nervous, Madam Speaker. The bottom line is that, and I've said this consistently, is that this is a government that is very much aware of the issue of inflation. We have a budget that is reflective of what it is that Canadians have been telling us. It's a budget that deals with the issue of inflation in a very tangible way. We will continue to work with stakeholders, Madam Speaker, to minimize the negative impact of inflation on Canadians, while at the same time build a country and an economy that's there for all Canadians.